All right, great. Thank you, Christine. And hello, everybody. I'm Sara Hendricks. I'm going to be presenting today this module on Introduction to Emergency Ride Home Programs. This was a presentation that was developed by Phil Winters, and a lot of the information comes from two surveys that have been done. One was a survey that the Center for Urban Transportation Research had done of providers of guaranteed ride home programs. And then there was another survey that had been done by the Metropolitan Washington Council of Governments, a survey of customers. So with that, let's get started. So the learning objectives of this module are to identify the fundamental considerations in the design of a guaranteed ride home program or emergency ride home program. Those two names seem to be interchangeable, and generalize the results of a 2020 survey of ERH programs, and then summarize the estimated impacts of ERH on behavior. And so we're going to start with a couple of polls. And as Christine said, there's you can either use the QR code or you can join by menti.com, and the use code is at the top there. And the question is, does your transit agency or commuter services program have an emergency ride home or a guaranteed ride home?
Seems really popular.
Yeah. Yeah.
Oh. All right. Seems to be slowing down.
And we're getting some answers in the chat too as well. Let's see. Kat asks, is this equivalent to GRP? Guaranteed. I haven't seen GRP. I'm not sure what else that might stand for. GRP. Guaranteed Ride Program, perhaps? I've always only ever seen it as GRH or ERH. There you go. Yes. Guaranteed Ride Home. Yes, it is. Okay. Some places do not have it. All right.
So I moved on to the second question.
Okay. And that'll come up in a moment here. I'm still seeing the first question on the screen. There we go. So were you involved in the planning and design of the emergency ride home program? Right. Okay, great. I think as we use Mentimeter more often, people will get more comfortable with it. And thanks, David. You said yes, but more about redesign versus the original. That counts. Thanks, David. All right. Well, maybe we can move along. Thanks for participating in those polls. And now we're gonna find out, what is emergency ride home or guaranteed ride home. And we have a YouTube that was developed by the San Diego Association of Governments. There we go. Thanks, Christine. So now one more thing. So what are the benefits of having an emergency ride home program or a guaranteed ride home program to the commuter or the individual and to the TDM agency? And you can put some answers in the chat box. Eliminate barriers to riding the service. It allows some to try a service they would otherwise not try. Yes. It reduces stress. Yes. Peace of mind for riders. Great. Yes, all of those things. Yeah, so guaranteed ride home makes alternative modes more feasible, more secure, more flexible, especially to non-drivers and also to low-income employees because they avoid unexpected emergency expenses while using alternative commute options that can also save them money. And the program tends to be very cost effective to sponsors. So for example, in 1993, COMSIS estimated that the Guaranteed Ride Home program typically averages less than about $5 per employee per year, and that was in 1993 dollars. Since less than 10% of eligible employees use the Guaranteed Ride Home, the Warner Center, TMA, in Los Angeles found that about 1% of the 6,000 eligible rideshare patrons used the service, and a nationwide survey of 11 guaranteed ride home programs by KT Analytics found that their average use is about 13 rides per 100 eligible employees per year. And thanks for all those reasons. Backup plan for van pooling, carpooling, employee benefit, provides quality of life, less stress for unexpected emergencies. Okay, great. All right, let's move on to the next slide, where we have a kind of a list of benefits. Many of these you've already identified. And so a guaranteed ride home program shows that the employer cares about the employee's well-being and is willing to provide support services. So this gesture is likely to increase employee satisfaction, commitment, and retention. And the program also enhances TDM objectives of increasing use of alternative modes. So for example, in 2004, there was a Nelson Nygaard report for the Alameda County program in California. Their program survey found that between 1998 and 2000, the percentage of program participants using an alternative mode at least 4 times per week increased from 9% to 25%. And 19% of them said they would not use an alternative mode without having the Guaranteed Ride Home program. Next slide, please. And so what are the considerations when developing an emergency ride home? What we do know is not all programs are created equal. And let's go to the next slide, where we're going to look at some information that had been collected from an emergency ride home program survey that was done at CUTR in 2020 of they were members of best workplaces for commuters, employers, as well as others. Who have employees that have access to the emergency ride home program. And so here are some comparative characteristics of emergency ride home programs. And the responses are listed in order of frequency of use. And so you can see at the top, over 80% have a limit on the frequency of use by total number of trips per month or year. So that's typical of emergency ride home programs. Just a little bit under 70% require receipts when applicable. So those are probably reimbursable type programs. And a little bit over 50% require a pre-registration process. But you can see there's a variety of other components that make up many emergency ride home programs. Next slide, please. And so there are a bunch of basic decisions that need to be made in creating a guaranteed ride home program. And so, for example, which modes qualify a commuter to access guaranteed ride home or emergency ride home benefits? So it's important to determine who is eligible. For example, do part-time employees qualify? How often must someone use alternative modes to qualify? What is the service area of the guaranteed ride home program? So first, this operating area really needs to be defined. We need to define the boundaries of the service area, and sometimes the program might be funded by a jurisdiction that may not allow service beyond its jurisdiction. So unfortunately, this might put limits, especially if the service area is just a small portion of a larger urbanized area. And then also, what are allowable destinations for the commuter using the guaranteed ride home program? So we need to identify eligible destinations. For example, can users be taken to daycare? How far from the work site can they be taken? How about a transit center? And then what are allowable intermediate stops for the commuter using the guaranteed ride home program? So related to destinations is the issue of intermediate stops. Can a user who needs to pick up a sick child from a daycare be allowed to continue with the ride home? How about a second stop to pick up another child? What if they typically pick up groceries on their way home? Does that count? And so allowable reasons for use is one area that's very likely to create administrative dilemmas. So would working overtime count? How about attending a meeting during the day? So some unusual reasons for requests have included bad weather or rushing back home to lock the door. So these things have come up. And while most organizations rely on the use of taxi service, this does not have to be the case always. There are other modes that might be used too. So in some cases, the employer can keep extra bus passes or tickets for potential guaranteed ride home users. And for long distance, a rental car may be preferable over a taxi due to the costs. Next slide, please. So which modes qualify a commuter to access emergency ride home benefits? So this is more information from the CUTR survey, and we see van pool, carpool, and bus transit are the most often cited as modes that qualify a commuter to access the emergency ride home program. Note that single occupant vehicle does not qualify you to use emergency ride home. However, it does show in this that about 6% of respondents of the survey said it is allowed. So there's no absolutes here. And this demonstrates that all these different emergency ride home programs are different one from another. They all have made different decisions about what qualifies and what doesn't. Next slide, please. And so what are allowable reasons for using your organization's guaranteed ride home program? And so the respondents were permitted to check all that apply. And once again, the answers were listed here in order of most recently, or most frequently rather, selected to the ones that were the least frequently selected. And you can see there's a whole bunch of different allowable reasons for different programs, but the ones that tend to be the most frequently used reason have to do with sickness of a child, or sickness of the employee, or the unavailability of the carpool van pool driver because of sickness. Next slide, please. So what are allowable destinations for the commuter using the guaranteed ride home program? And once again, we see the percentages for the different destinations, home being the overwhelmingly top choice. Guaranteed ride home programs tend to primarily provide people a ride home, which is part of the name. But there are other allowed destinations: park and ride lots, child daycare center, doctor office, transit station. And interestingly, on the right side of this bar chart, you can see 10% ride to work in the event of carpool driver is unavailable. So that's an interesting kind of twist on this, that there are some programs that allow a ride to work. It's not just the ride home. Next slide, please. And so there are more basic decisions for developing a guaranteed ride home program. So as we've already seen, taxi and rental cars can be used in alternation depending on distance. Other options include use of a backup carpool or van pool, especially for large employers whose large employee base may allow possibilities like that. And then these later options tend to be more attractive where overtime situations are the company fleet car. In some cases, employers have used their fleet cars to drop off guaranteed ride home users or allowed them to check out the fleet car.
Hey, Sarah,
Next slide, please. Yeah.
Sarah, one item that I neglected to put on this was a coworker. So I know that there are some that will allow reimbursement of the coworker's mileage if they take somebody home. Say somebody's ill, for example. If they are able to get a coworker to take them home, they'll get their whatever 45 cents a mile or whatever.
Mm-hmm. Thanks, Phil. Yeah, I think you had that on one of these other slides as well.
Yeah.
All right. Okay, let's look at the next slide. So how does your organization provide emergency ride home or guaranteed ride home? And the respondents could check all that apply. And the blue is provided by a third party, either a transportation management association or a commuter assistance program on behalf of the organization. The green is provided by their organization, an employer. And what we find most commonly are contracted taxis, tend to be most common, or transportation network companies such as Uber and Lyft. Perhaps lesser common might be any taxi service or transit or rental cars. But once again, we see some variation in this. Next slide, please. And so here's an example of the use of transportation network companies as a provider for an emergency ride home program in King County, Washington. So the registrants are provided with up to 8 promo codes a year that can be used to pay for transportation network company rides in case of emergency or when they cannot find a return trip home. And the promo codes are distributed through their rideshare organization, rideshareonline.com. Registrants receive 1 code at a time. The registrant must have taken an eligible trip on the same day that they're requesting the emergency ride home. The registrants arrange their own ride through their own personal TNC accounts. And the emergency ride home promo code will pay for rides up to 60 miles or $100. And the promo codes do not pay tips. So that's an example of the use of TNCs by one organization that provides the service. Next slide. And this is a list of TDM agencies using transportation network companies as part of emergency ride home. So you can see that it's becoming perhaps more common. These are examples from all over the United States. Rethink is Central Florida that provides reimbursable rides. They treat transportation network companies the same as taxi reimbursements, up to $600 per calendar year. In Los Angeles, LA Metro provides the cost of an Uber or Lyft ride that is reimbursable up to 2 times per fiscal year. In Santa Barbara, it's limited to 4 times, up to $220 total per year. Metro Transit in Minneapolis, Minnesota, has a limit of 4 times, up to $100 a year. And then in Boston, this is the Medical, Academic, and Scientific Community Organization. They'll book a Lyft ride and send the driver and ride updates through the Lyft app, and a confirmation report is required to be filed within 5 days. Next slide, please. And there's more basic decisions in creating a guaranteed ride home or emergency ride home program. So, when can they access the program? Do they need to pre-register for the service? Do they have to get authorization to be allowed to take the ride prior to it? How many times can they use it? So there are considerations about the limit by mileage or some dollar cap or limit by frequency of use. Oftentimes it's some number of times up to a certain number of trips per year. How much will the user pay? And then there's always the question about driver tips. And then how will you handle the unexpected? So you might also want to identify in the chat if you can think of other things, other criteria that need to be considered for creating a guaranteed ride home program. What are we missing in this list? Slide. And so here's some more information from the CUTR survey. So for each eligible commuter, what is the maximum number of emergency ride home or guaranteed ride home trips that a commuter is allowed to use per year? And so we see among the responses, almost half said 4 or less rides per year. There was another 30% that provided a little more generous, 5 to 6 rides per year, but you can see that there's a bit of a range. There's actually a few programs that provide unlimited rides per year. And then there's an other category where you can see there's quite the variation in how the limit is set for the use of the guaranteed ride home program. So for example, program participants are limited to a maximum reimbursement of $600 per calendar year or 6 reimbursed trips per calendar year, whichever occurs first. So that is not an uncommon way of creating the limit. Next slide, please. And I'm seeing a couple answers with regard to criteria. Let's see here. So Kathleen says have to record their trip in the program's app prior to the ride request to be eligible. Okay. So some guaranteed ride home programs have an app associated with the use of the service. Thank you. And so how is the payment of an emergency ride home trip made? And the respondents to the survey that collected this information allowed to check all that apply. And so 57% said that it's a reimbursement paid to the employee. So that's an important consideration because the employee has to have the ability to pay upfront for their emergency ride home. Another 33% said that we receive a bill after the fact by the taxi company. 22% provide a voucher to the employee so that the employee can give it to the driver. So that's an alternative way of doing it. And there are some other payment options as well. Oh, and at the bottom here it says reimbursement paid to a coworker who drives the employee. So that's something that Phil mentioned a few minutes ago. So that's another way of doing it. Next slide, please. So there's some fundamental questions for a guaranteed ride home program or emergency ride home program. As we mentioned earlier, an employer or a third party can provide these services through a variety of options. And these include things like taxi rides reimbursed by the program sponsor. It could be company vehicles of an employer. It could be car rentals contracted by employers. It could be transit passes offered by the program sponsor. And we don't want these to be too cumbersome, but there is a need for some minimum criteria to be established, as mentioned before. And these might include things like eligibility. The program could cover all employees or only those who use alternative modes for a specified portion of commuting? What are allowable trips? So the program could cover any trip, or it could be limited to unexpected business appointments or overtime. It could apply to earlier departure of a carpool or a van pool, employee or family member sickness, and other personal emergencies. Then there's the question of maximum usage. So is it during a certain period, or maximum miles within a period, or maximum cost for trip? And then a designated contact person. Is it the human resources department, the parking, security? Is it the employee transportation coordinator of the organization? And then there's enrollment procedures to think about. So what would be the typical implementation steps? And then to enhance these policy specifications, there may need to be some precautionary measures considered. So these might include things like involving stakeholders. So the stakeholders might be the employees, the taxi companies, car share organizations, other contractors should be involved in the planning process. It should be tied closely to the commute options that are available. So a guaranteed ride home program should be designed for and derived from the type of commute options that are implemented and available to the employees. And then consider co-payments. So the guaranteed ride home may be free, or it might require a modest co-payment from the service user. And then there might be limit restrictions. So this may allow commuters to participate in unplanned non-emergency events that can still affect their decision whether or not to drive. And it's most effective if requirements are not restricted to emergency trips alone. And then also anticipating the cost. So for example, Commuter Transportation Services in Los Angeles, they suggested an estimation that's between about 0.5% and 20% of current rideshare patrons, ranging from companies allowing rides for overtime, errands, or business trips, all the way to companies that only allow it for emergency use only. And then, of course, an important consideration that is oftentimes overlooked is to communicate the program details to the commuters. Let them know that this program exists. Make them aware of this program. And let's go to the next slide. All right, so this is a YouTube from South Florida Commuter Services.
Congratulations for registering for South Florida Commuter Services Emergency Ride Home Program, or ERH for short. Now, before you go scheduling any trips, we want to spend just a few seconds going over what will be covered and what will not. So, what's covered? Well, should you suddenly become sick at work or have to leave work immediately for an unexpected urgent situation, you're covered. Should your carpool or van pool suddenly become unavailable due to unexpected circumstances, you're covered. Should you unexpectedly be required to work later than normal, which forces you to miss your scheduled ride home, don't worry, you're covered. Pretty straightforward, right? Now that you have an idea of what is considered an emergency by the ERH program, here are a few situations that are not. Personal errands, like running home to walk your overactive dog or working late when you've known in advance that this day was coming, not covered. Pre-planned appointments like a follow-up doctor visit or dentist appointment, or business-related travel such as having to be at another meeting in an office across town, or alien abduction. Well, due to legal restrictions, we cannot provide emergency services to anyone experiencing any intergalactic events. So sorry, not covered. Bad weather. Hey, it's South Florida. Unfortunately, we all have to deal with the unpredictable weather. Even transit failures, such as broken down bus or train delays. Yes, that stinks, but no, it's not covered. Hey, we think you get the point, but it is ultimately your responsibility to make sure that you know what is and isn't covered to utilize the ERH program. One other thing, In order to be picked up, you must be at the place of employment or school that matches your South Florida Commuter Services registration. So when the unexpected occurs and you have a valid emergency, give us a call. Provide your commuter ID and ERH voucher number from your voucher, as well as your complete destination address. SFCS will dispatch a taxi for you. And when your taxi arrives, don't forget to provide the driver with your completely filled out voucher, including your signature. If you don't, it could lead to a violation. Remember, do not call any taxi company directly or you'll be responsible for all travel costs. Call our South Florida Commuter Services Customer Service Department. Have any questions? Simply give us a call at 1-800-234-7433.
Go. All right. So that's a good example of communicating to potential guaranteed ride home users what are eligible uses and what are not eligible uses. And I think we just lost the our PowerPoint, Christine.
Hold on, I'll share it again.
Okay. Yes, I agree. This was a fun video. And Kyle says we would never leave someone stranded in at work with employee customer directly. And Rogelia says they use Uber now, did not need paper voucher to use it. Okay. All right, thanks for that clarification. Okay, great. All right. Well, I'm glad you enjoyed that video. So let's look at the typical steps for implementing a guaranteed ride home or emergency ride home program. So for example, identify and decide on the commute options the company would offer. These might include transit, rideshare, bike, walk, perhaps even skateboard or, micro-mobility type options, and ensure top-level support of the commute options. Secondly, would be to tailor the guaranteed ride home program plans to the commute options selected. So this would be developing a program description based on the selected commute options, itemizing the benefits to the employer and related opportunities, and then also itemizing the costs to the employer and the related challenges. And then also determining the feasibility of offering a guaranteed ride home program. So estimate the average cost. It might be something like, $5 per or 20% of current rideshare patrons per year, as we saw in previous slides, or identify potential providers and assess their requirements, assess employee commute needs and the support to use the program. So what do the employees need in order to use this service? What kind of support? And then ensure, once again, top-level support for the guaranteed ride home program. And then develop program policies and procedures. And it's always better to anticipate what might happen rather than have to be put in a position of reacting to an unusual circumstance. And this includes involving your stakeholders throughout the process. And the stakeholders are, management, employers, employees, the sponsors of the program, service providers, and then also specify eligibility, such as the type of commute, the times of commute, employee status, whether it's, full-time or part-time employees are eligible, and determine whether employees will use vouchers or be reimbursed, and then the approval procedures. So what you're trying to do is balance the convenience of the way the program is designed against the possibility that somebody might attempt to abuse it. And then develop appropriate paperwork. So these are things like registration forms, ID cards, reimbursement vouchers, and who needs a copy of that reimbursement voucher. And David says, I'm curious if programs that support bike ped commutes have built in a weather reason eligibility. And that kind of crossed my mind too, David. Like, for example, in South Florida, They were very clear about the fact that weather is not a good reason, or is not an eligible reason for using the guaranteed ride home. And certainly bad weather is definitely something that bicyclists and pedestrians in particular are worried about, or could be concerned about with regard to getting home. Yes, I'm interested in that as well. And then also allocating resources. So you could, for example, assign an employee transportation coordinator who will administer the program and serve as a liaison with outside providers or the jurisdictions and other related entities. Make appropriate arrangements with the service providers, such as the taxi companies or the rental car companies, the local transit agency, and any other relevant service providers. And then lastly, managing the program, which involves a number of things. So you want to be continually promoting the program to potential users of the alternative modes that you're interested in promoting. And to emphasize, this is a safety net for participants. And the information of availability versus encouraging their use are among those considerations. And then ensure that the service is fast, reliable, and convenient. So that requires monitoring and keeping records. Analyze the patterns of use of the service, especially about the frequency of use, certain kinds of uses that might indicate or address a larger issue. Problems amongst employees with things like, childcare or unpaid or unplanned overtime or accidents. And then monitor the program against abuse by employees or by service providers. And then lastly, keeping your stakeholders informed, especially management and service providers informed as to the status of the program and how it's going. And I see in the chat, let's see, Lorena Sierra has a YouTube in there on reimbursable rides. Thank you for sharing that. And Kyle says, we had a van pool group that lost the key for the van at the work site. So they were suggested to do emergency ride home and pick up a replacement key from your office. So that makes a world of sense. Yes, that's very reasonable. Thanks for sharing that, Kyle. All right, let's go to the next slide. So now we're going to talk briefly about typical challenges of guaranteed ride home programs. So possible high costs. So taxis, company car or rentals, especially for programs serving commuters that are working late or overtime. However, experience indicates that employer costs are usually low, especially for programs offering emergency service during the workday only. And it's very cost-effective way to reduce automobile commuting. So in general, taxis are cost-effective for short trips, while auto rentals are preferable for longer trips. And then liability exposure. So in case of accidents and late arrivals to appointments, but this needs to be specified in policies and sign-up forms. So in many states, worker compensation laws only recognize where an employee is carrying out employment duties. Is there some exposure to liability? Next slide. So now let's look at some results of emergency ride home programs. And so this is from the emergency ride home survey done at CUTR. So what is the total annual number of emergency ride home trips provided by your organization? And so it was kind of separated out by emergency ride home provider on the left and employers who provide the service on the right. And what we see is some similarities, 1 to 24 trips annually provided by these service providers, but there is some variation. Interestingly, for the employer providers, about 20% of the employers aren't keeping any track of it. That's probably not a good idea. Next slide. And then what is the approximate average cost per claim? And here again, there's quite a variation, but it seems like about 45% of them are somewhere in the range of about $20 to $40 per claim for a guaranteed ride home trip. And then okay, yes, next slide, thank you. And so what portion of the trip cost is paid by your organization or third party on your organization's behalf? And what we see is over 50% pay 100% of the trip cost without the trip. And that is up to a specific limit. And then it looks like about 35% or so pay 100% of the trip cost, plus a reasonable tip up to some certain specific limit. And we do see that there is some degree of variation. There are a program or two that will pay about half of the trip cost up to some specific limit. And then there are some other responses. So another way of paying the cost of the trip is to provide a flat amount, regardless of the total cost of the trip. And then another option that two survey respondents provided is 100% of the cost without the tip, no dollar limit for the eligible trip. So that's that can be quite generous if we're talking about emergency ride homes for example, van pool riders. Next slide, please. And so let's also look at some results from a survey that was done by the Metropolitan Washington Council of Governments about providing the Guaranteed Ride Home program by Commuter Connections. And that is a link to the report survey of commuters. And they conducted this survey across a period of multiple years. Next slide, please. And so, for example, they surveyed on awareness of the Regional Guaranteed Ride Home program, and they displayed awareness based on the primary mode over time. And it shows that people who ride the train seem to be a bit more aware, but over a 12-year period, it appears that perhaps awareness has dropped somewhat across all the different modes. Next slide, please.
I would also suggest, Sarah, that COVID had something to do with the drop in 22, that people just not paying attention to guaranteed ride home.
Right. That's an excellent point.
Especially in the DC area with so many federal employees working from home.
Right. That's a good point. Thanks, Phil. Okay. And then, so primary modes used, pre-guaranteed ride home versus during guaranteed ride home. So pre-guaranteed ride home is before they've registered to use the program versus during a guaranteed ride home, which is after they registered and they're eligible to use the program. And so respondents were asked about their commute modes during the time they participated in the guaranteed ride home program and before they participated. So for current registrants, the during guaranteed ride home mode was their current mode, as described earlier. And because past registrants might have changed modes since they left the program, these respondents were asked about their weekly travel during the time that they were registered. So all the respondents also were asked about their pre-GRH modes. So current and past registrants were asked about the time before they registered. And so what was found is that more than a quarter, about 26% of respondents primarily drove alone pre-GRH. The drive alone mode share dropped to just 4% for the during guaranteed ride home period. And the shares of respondents primarily using alternative modes, and those are transit, carpool, vanpool, bike, and walk, increased from 70% to 80%. And so the other notable change between the pre-guaranteed ride home and the during guaranteed ride home period was an apparent increase in the share of respondents who said they primarily teleworked while they were registering or registered for guaranteed ride home. Only 4% of the respondents said they primarily teleworked. So that means three or more days per week before they joined the guaranteed ride home. But 16% said they primarily teleworked while they participated in the guaranteed ride home program. So they looked further at that. Further analysis found that when asked how many days they were teleworking in early 2020, just before the start of the pandemic, most of them, about 74% of the respondents, said that they teleworked less than 3 days per week, which would not be primary telework as their mode. So this suggests that some past respondents might have mistakenly reported telework as their mode while participating in guaranteed ride home because they were still registered for guaranteed ride home when they shifted to primary telework at the start of the pandemic, even though they were no longer eligible to use the guaranteed ride home. And let's see. So Kyle said here that their longest vanpool group has a 176 DRTM, which would be quite, I don't know what DRTM is. Is it mileage? Would be quite the transportation network company. I'm sorry, say again?
Daily round trip mileage is what I assume.
Okay, round trip, okay. Yes, that would be quite a transportation network company trip back home. And we would ask them to check with their employer first before they use ours. Yes, daily round trip mileage. Okay, thank you. Thanks for sharing that. That's, yes, that would be quite a costly trip. Okay, reasons for taking a most recent guaranteed ride home trip. So this slide lists the reasons for which participants used the service for their most recent trip, and 3/4 of the guaranteed ride home trips were taken to address an illness. So that's respondent, 33%, another family member, 29%, or a child, 11%. And then unscheduled overtime was 13%, and other personal emergencies, 9%, were the two other common reasons. And so this chart shows the comparison across the 3 survey time periods. And it appears to me that it shows a certain degree of stability in terms of the reasons used for taking their most recent guaranteed ride home trip. Next slide, please. There you go. Close to 75% for illness reasons. So the role of guaranteed ride home in motivating change. So Metropolitan Washington Council of Governments, they were comparing, well, what's the importance of offering guaranteed ride home program versus some of the other services that Commuter Connections was providing. And what they found was that for 44% of employees who were maintaining use of an alternative mode, guaranteed ride home was the only service that they were receiving. And for 49% who are increasing their use of an alternative mode use, once again, guaranteed ride home was the only Commuter Connection service that they were receiving. And for 38% who started using an alternative mode, once again, guaranteed ride home was the only Commuter Connections service that they were receiving. And then they also found that guaranteed ride home was the most important Commuter Connections service that they received for those 34% who were maintaining their use of an alternative mode, 26% who were increasing their use of an alternative mode, and then 30% who started using an alternative mode. And so we're finding that guaranteed ride home is very important. And they also went on to say in their survey results that only the following shares of commuter connections commuters found any non-GRH service to be more important than guaranteed ride home. So 22% who were maintaining the use of their alternative mode, 25% who were increasing their use, and then 32% who had started an alternative mode use. And so the list on the right are some examples of the other non-guaranteed ride home services that Commuter Connections had been providing. Next slide. Okay. And so now we're going to share just a few examples of marketing materials that have been developed by various programs offering guaranteed ride home. You know, one of the most important elements of emergency ride home or guaranteed ride home effectiveness is to let employers and businesses know that the program exists, letting commuters, employees know that the program exists and provide the facts about how it works. And so here are just a few examples. And next slide, please. And so Yo Taxi in San Francisco. So you can take an official taxi or public transportation for your emergency ride home using that service. However, rides taken by a transportation network company like Uber or Lyft are not eligible for reimbursement. So that's an interesting kind of a difference. You know, a lot of programs, a lot of guaranteed ride home programs are using TNCs now. This is an example where a TNC use is not eligible for reimbursement. So shared rides taken through TNCs, such as Uber Pool or Lyft Line, also are not eligible for reimbursement through this program. And so what commuters and registrants are asked to do is download. It's an app. It's the Yo Taxi app or also Flywheel to order a taxi when they need a ride. So that's a few other examples, and to demonstrate that these programs are all designed differently. And next slide, please. And so here's a brochure from Commute Smart in San Francisco, and they're providing information to both the customers, which are the commuters or employees, as well as information directed to employers or businesses to make sure that both these groups understand about how the Guaranteed Ride Home program works, who's eligible, and that it exists. This is a program that's available for use. And next slide. And so here's an example from Commute Solano, which is in Solano County, which is near San Francisco. They provide vouchers and a list of approved taxi companies and rental car companies. And the rental car companies you're expected to use if your ride home is more than 30 miles. So they were doing kind of a cost comparison there. And next slide. So this is one more example from Portland TriMet. Their emergency ride home is available only to those who work within the TriMet service district. So these examples all kind of demonstrate how these different criteria have been decided upon and then communicated to potential users. Next slide. So we're coming to the end of this module, and just to summarize, Emergency Ride Home, Guaranteed Ride Home is an augmented product that helps commuters overcome one of the major barriers of changing modes. It's often simple in execution, but there are many decisions that need to be made in the program design. And we encourage you to revisit how you are promoting your Guaranteed Ride Home program, and including pilot testing existing and new materials. And next slide. And so we come to our homework. And so what we would like to ask you to do is use the checklist. And Christine put a screenshot of it here. I believe it's also a PDF, but use the checklist to design your emergency ride home program, or you can use it to document an existing emergency ride home program and then email that to Christine by next Tuesday. Is there any questions or comments?
I added the link to the checklist in the chat if you want to get started on it early. It'll go out in tomorrow's email with the recording as well.
Great. Thank you, Christine. And then I guess we have an evaluation as well
We do.
for you to complete.
Hi, Sarah, a question for you.
Yes.
I was wondering how many organizations are limit the number of times or the dollar amount based on kind of the de facto $600 tax limit, like for avoiding sending out 1099s to individuals.
Hmm. I'm not aware of that. Phil? I'm not aware of that question. What is your question again? Can you repeat that question?
Yeah. I mean, a program we were setting up kind of ran into this issue where it seemed like if there was anything more than a de minimis, kind of reimbursement or payment to individuals, then a public agency would have to issue a 1099 to an individual, like if it was more than $600 a year. And so that program was set up just to avoid that so that the maximum benefit was less than $600. And I'm just wondering if other programs or other folks you've heard of have, dealt with that or have considered that issue when setting up their maximums.
So reimbursing an expense that was documented was determined to be income?
Yeah, well, in a different situation, it was more about an incentive.
Okay, that makes more sense. Yeah.
But I guess in this situation, like even if it was reimbursing someone's expense, if it was a public agency giving money to a member of the public who was claiming an emergency ride home, I mean, that would still be a net transfer of money to a person, right?
Right, but you received documentation of the expense that categorized it as a legitimate business expense rather than a compensation, I would think. Right, the taxi receipt or the TNC receipt.
Okay, that's interesting. Yeah.
I'm not a tax expert. That's kind of how we viewed it in our agency when I was with Metro.
Cool. Thank you.
Thank you, David.
Yeah, I'd never heard that question before. I mean, but that is interesting. Probably does warrant talking to legal or a tax expert.
Yes.
Yeah, from an
Yes, thank
incentive
you.
point, I agree from the incentive point of view, it makes sense. I'm not sure about the reimbursement. That is definitely interesting. I know we had an incentive that we were providing for basically equivalent of like $5 a day, and the university told us if they were going to get more than $300 a year, we needed to get them set up for a potential 1099 reporting.
Okay, thank you.
Okay. So words matter. Is it an incentive or is it a reimbursable business expense? Okay. Any other difficult questions? This is a great group to have together. Because a lot of you have really good background experience from the work that you've done with various agencies. So.
Okay, thanks.
All right. Well, thank you so much for your participation. And remember what Christine said. Next week is in Florida. It's a state holiday. It's Juneteenth, so we will not be having our a class next Wednesday. So we'll see you on the 26th.
That's good.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye-bye.